Right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here on a Saturday. I'm going to get things started. I have to start by apologizing, though. Our normal interviewer is not here at the moment. He must be having some technical difficulties. So hopefully Lopen Karma Phuntsho will be here momentarily. But the show must go on. So welcome to this special edition of our Conversations on Buddha Nature, a celebration of the publication of The Natural Openness and Freedom of the Mind. So thank you for taking time to join us. I'm just getting a message from our, oh dear, he's lost. All right, well, apologies also for my voice. I'm a bit sick this morning, so apologies for that. I shall do my best here. We've had some technical difficulties also with Stephen's video, but hopefully you can see and hear us okay. So, this series of online interviews with Buddhist practitioners, scholars, and thinkers is hosted by Tsadra Foundation in association with the educational resource website buddhanature.org. Please feel free to send questions with the Q&A function on Zoom, or if you're on Facebook, use the comments during the discussion, and we'll have a time set aside for questions with the speaker at the end. So, today we're here with Master Translator Stephen Gethin. Stephen studied veterinary medicine at Cambridge University, where he was also awarded a choral exhibition. After a number of years in professional practice, he spent much of the 1980s undertaking 2 3-year retreats in France, where he now lives, and as a founding member of the Padmakara Translation Group, continues to translate. He was a Tsadra Foundation Translation Fellow from 2005 to 2024. His many published translations include Nagarjuna's Letter to a Friend, with Longchenpa Yeshe Dorje Khangsar Rinpoche commentary, Zerchungpa's Testament, A Garland of Views, A Guide to View, Meditation, and Result in the 9 Vehicles, which is Jamgon Mipam's commentary on Padmasambhava's Garland of Views, Dudjom Rinpoche's A Torch Lighting the Way to Freedom, A Feast of the Nectar of the Supreme Vehicle, which is a huge volume, the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara, with commentary by Mipam, again. You can tell there's a theme here in the kinds of translations. A Chariot to Freedom, Mahasiddha Practice in our Damnat Zu series, volume 15, Awakening Wisdom from Pema Wangyal, and then a series that he's working on now from Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk's collected works are coming out slowly. So the one that we're talking about today is the Natural Openness and Freedom of the Mind. He also collaborated on other translations you all may know, A Flash of Lightning in the Dark of Night by the Dalai Lama, Wisdom, 2 Buddhist Commentaries, The Words of My Perfect Teacher by Patrul Rinpoche, and A Guide to the Words of My Perfect Teacher by Khenpo Ngawang Pelsang. So there's really an amazing history of translation and an amazing career to celebrate here as well as we talk about this book. So thank you so much for being here with us. Oh, and I see Karma is joining us as well. Hello, Karma.
Hello. Sorry, I'm late.
That's okay.
But I'm here.
But you're here now. Wonderful. Thank you. So I've just made an initial introduction. So why don't we just get started, Karma?
Thank you, Marcus. And thank you, Stephen, for joining us for these conversations. And Kuzu Zampo, Tashidele, Namaste from Kathmandu to everyone attending the session. So before we start the session, if we can spend a few moments to cultivate the altruistic intention so that this session and whatever we do bring benefit to both oneself and others. Thank you. So once again, Stephen, thank you very much for joining us. We have had these conversations for some years now, and this is a forum where we try to bring scholars, practitioners, translators to share their insights and experience on Buddhist topics in general, and particularly the work they do that are relevant to Buddha nature, as these conversations are part of our events to promote the Buddha Nature website, the website resource that Zadra Foundation has developed. So we hope we'll be able to provide a good forum for you to share experience, and that we will learn a lot from you. To begin with, I would like to ask Stephen to share a bit about yourself. I don't know much about you apart from the introduction that we just heard, and I think many people in the audience would also know, or at least would like to know more. So if you can share how you got into your current position to translate something like this very advanced Dzogchen material, how did your spiritual journey begin to reach here?
I had a sort of fairly classical English private school education, and that involved chapel every morning and twice on Sundays. But I actually used to enjoy the sermons, and at school, as a teenager, I studied the Bible and I tried to be a good Christian. But by the time I left school, I'd sort of realized that there wasn't something that wasn't quite sufficient for me. I was seeking something a bit more than the way God and Christianity had been presented to me, at least. And I happened to go take a trip overland from England to Kathmandu. This wasn't actually intentionally as a spiritual quest. It was just something that people did in those days. It was partly adventure. But we stopped at Bodh Gaya, and I remember at the Mahabodhi Stupa feeling something. I can't say what it was really, but I definitely felt that something was there. And I was also very impressed by the Tibetan temple. I say the Tibetan temple because at that time there was just a Tibetan temple, a Burmese temple, a Thai temple. I think the Japanese temple was in the process of being built. Otherwise, there was practically nothing else at Bodh Gaya in those days. But then we continued to Kathmandu, and I saw Swayambhu. I cycled out to Bodhanath Stupa, which at the time had just one single circle of buildings around it. Otherwise, it was just all green fields. And it was covered in scaffolding at the time because it had been, I think, damaged according to the prophecy, and was being repaired. Anyway, I didn't really follow up my interest in Buddhism then. But in retrospect, I think a seed was sown. And when I got to Cambridge, I found that I was in the same college as John Canty, whom I had known several years before at school. And his immediate next door neighbor was Charles Hastings, who had been, he'd been out east. I think he'd been in Dharamsala then and had been receiving teachings. And so in due course, I joined the University Buddhist Society, and immediately sort of something clicked. I think this must be common with a lot of Westerners. They realized that this is what they were looking for, or that this is a wisdom and a way of life and all that they can immediately relate to. And so I went out to Dharamsala in one of the summer vacations and studied with Geshe Rabten, the Lamrim. And then a second time, the summer after, John and I both went out. Funnily enough, I found I had a family connection. with Dharamsala because my great-grandfather had owned a tea garden there at Sidbari, just below Dharamsala. And my grandparents had been married there. They couldn't get married in the church because it had been knocked down by an earthquake. So they took a table and put it in a clearing in the forest and got married that way. And then another earthquake destroyed the house in which my grandmother and my mother as a tiny baby were staying on the tea garden. And my grandmother threw my mother out the window, made a nice soft landing on top of the tea bushes. And then she threw herself out, and after that looked up and the house was no longer there. So perhaps otherwise I might not be here, who knows. But anyway, after those, following those studies in Dharamsala, back to Charles Hastings in the meanwhile, went out to India, and he met first of all Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche, who told him that he should go to Darjeeling to meet Khyentse Rinpoche. And so that's how, one after another, John and I came to meet Khyentse Rinpoche and his family, and of course his sons Padmakara Rinpoche and Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche. And after that, we also met Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche and Yudra Nyingpo. We attended empowerments and teachings in India and Nepal. And so at the end of 1980, we three, Charles, John, and I, found ourselves beginning the first Nyingma retreat in France, 3-year retreat. And that, I suppose, was the embryonic beginnings of a Padmakara Translation Group. At that time, there were very few translations. I remember going into the retreat, I just had Stephen Batchelor's translation of the Bodhicharyavatara. I had the Jewel Ornament of Liberation. And there was also Judith Hanson's translation of Jangon Control's Torch of Certainty, which was really the only practical guide published that we knew of anyway, on the preliminary practices, the Mundro. But otherwise, there was very little. And we had 2 or 3 people in the retreat who knew Tibetan and were translating our practice texts as we went along. There was Christian Brouillard, who was working on the French translation of the Kanzaname Shalom, and that he was published in 1987. That was the very first Padmakara book. The English translation, Words of My Perfect Teacher, would have to wait another 7 years after that. There was Helena Blankleder, who knew Tibetan well, and she gave us some classes in the retreat on Tibetan grammar. And there was also Jakob Leschle, who was there as well. And they were translating, as I say, the essential practice texts and the sadhnas and things that we were doing in the temple together. But there were quite a lot of prayers that weren't, they didn't have time to translate. And so it was by necessity and curiosity that I started translating. I think it was the same for Charles and John. John already knew a bit of Tibetan. And of course, in those days, we relied on Sawat Chandra Das, which even though I hardly ever use it nowadays, I'm amazed at how much information he actually managed to glean from all those Tibetan lamas, considering he was actually busy being a British spy. But it's an extraordinary dictionary at the time. So that's how Padmakara started. When we came out of retreat, in fact, we sort of were in retreat most of the 1980s, we actually started forming the translation group. As I say, the French translation of the Khangsar Tenpa'i had just come out in 1987. And then in the meanwhile, Woolston Fletcher had joined us, and our first English publication was translated mainly by him, was Enlightened Courage, which was a translation of the teachings on the 7-point mind training that Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche had given us in 1990. And that was published, in fact, for the cremation of Khyentse Rinpoche. So that's sort of how Padmakara started and how I started.
So thank you. In fact, that was the second question I wanted to ask you. We had John some years ago, but we didn't manage to ask him about it. But we have you now. So it's wonderful to listen to a story of how it began in Cambridge Buddhist Society. I think we have this thing in common. I went there many times and gave, I think, 2 or 3 talks there. So I've been also involved in the society marginally. And John and you, both of you, seem to have started your Buddhist journey from there. Then, yes, the second thing I want to ask was about Padmakara. You shared the beginnings. What is the team like right now? How do you work? Who are involved? And, because this new book that you're launching, you don't give the individual translators sort of name. It is Padmakara Translation Group. So we would like to know more about the current group size and how you distribute the work. Is it all voluntary work? How does it work?
Well, at the beginning, we tried working as a translation group, all of us together. And that actually didn't work very well. It took too long to produce a compromise at the end, which wasn't always necessarily very satisfactory. So we basically tend to work individually, but then consult each other, particularly for points that points of expertise. Woolston and Helena work together, and I often ask them, because their speciality, well, first of all, Woolston has been the Madhyamaka. So if there are any difficult points of that sort, I'll consult them. And particularly for the Dzogchen, they've worked a lot on Dzogchen texts. They've translated Jigme Lingpa's Yontenze, Treasure of Precious Qualities, and the second volume, which contains a lot of Dzogchen. It presents the Dzogchen, and they hammered out a lot of the difficulties of terminology and all that, with explanations from Khenchen Pemashara, and also they had various sources, explanations from Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche. So in fact, for this particular book, the text we're sort of launching now, I relied very heavily actually on Helena's help and Woolston's, particularly for the terminology. That has the advantage, of course, that the COEs will have a reasonably consistent terminology for the Dzogchen texts in it. And in fact, you can see who the translators are for particular texts, because usually in the acknowledgements at the end of the translator's introduction, we're named. But of course, we publish under the sort of banner of the Padmakara Translation Group. I worked with John quite a lot at one point. He now is working pretty full-time on 84,000. Charles Hastings, similar, is taken up with the Khyentse Vision project. So for this series of Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk, there's basically just myself and Helena and Woolston working on it. At the beginning, to answer another part of your question, during the 1990s, we did manage to produce a few books. There was The Words of My Perfect Teacher. There was a commentary on, or two commentaries in one volume on the 9th chapter of the Bodhisattva. And of course, Woolston's translation of the Bodhisattva, The Way of the Bodhisattva. But we weren't terribly productive because we were having to do other jobs to keep the wolf from the door, as it were. And it was only just after the turn of the century that Sadra Foundation stepped in and started sponsoring us. And from that moment onward, we were able, through their generosity, to be able to translate full time. And that has continued up until now.
Wonderful, thank you. I mean, I've had my monastic education most in the Nyingma tradition. I did my postgraduate training also on Mipham and mainly Nyingma tradition. So Padmakara translations have been very useful. I think, especially in the Nyingma tradition, you have made a great deal of contribution. Now we have this new book. This is the second book on Dzogchen that we are discussing in 6 months. Actually, we had the first one a few months ago, the translation of Longchenpa's Choying Rinpoche, which is translated as a jewel treasure of Dharma Dhatu by Sangye Khandro and Lama Chönam. We had a very good discussion. Now we have the second book on Dzogchen. Dzogchen seems to be the fashionable topic for translation. So when we, now if you talk a bit about the new book, the new translation, it's the translation of Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk's commentary on Deshek Lingpa's text. So both Deshek Lingpa and Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk are quite new names, I suppose, even in the Tibetan Buddhist world. So definitely in the Western Tibetan Buddhist world, not many people would know about them. So I would like you to share a bit about the two authors. So firstly, Deshek Lingpa, where does he come from? Can you share what his background was to produce this book?
Yeah, I think both Deshek Lingpa and Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk were sort of hidden away in Golok. And although apparently they are better known in Tibet than in the West. But in fact, I'll just sort of introduce how we came to be translating Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk's texts. Is because they were published, or at least 5 volumes of his writings were published. And Pema Wangdo Rinpoche and Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche were very impressed with these writings. And they actually met Tenpa'i Wangchuk's disciples, who asked them if the Padmakara Translation Group could translate his collected works. And so that's how we come to be doing that. And Tenpa'i Wangchuk's nephew, Tulku Lhatsam Rinpoche, actually came over to France and gave us all the necessary transmissions. And after that, we started to translate them. In fact, we didn't manage to start immediately because we had other projects to finish first. But yes, this is the second volume that in the collected works that we've produced. And so Deshek Lingpa is actually a bit of a mystery, a mysterious figure, because we haven't managed to really get very much information about him. He died only 4 years ago. He was born in 1956 and passed away in January 2020. He was generally known as Tulku Lhatsam, and of course he didn't use his Tertön name, but apparently he used to sign himself Jigme Dorje, and Jigme Rinpoche, who is a disciple of Tenpa'i Wangchuk, asked us to refer to him as the second Deshek Lingpa, Tertön Jigme Dorje. And he's the second Deshek Lingpa because he called himself Deshek Lingpa after Rinzin Deshek Lingpa, who lived from 1842 to 1907, and who was a disciple of Natural Openness and Freedom. Deshek Lingpa, like Tenpa'i Wangchuk, was an emanation of Yudra Nyingpo. Yudra Nyingpo was one of the 25 disciples of Padmasambhava, but he was also a disciple of Vairotsana and Vimalamitra. And so I imagine Tenpa'i Wangchuk writing a commentary on Deshek Lingpa's Terma. They would have been very much, as emanation, both emanations of Yudra Nyingpo, very much on the same wavelength. Jigme Rinpoche told me that Deshek Lingpa this second Deshek Lingpa should be referred to as a Tertön because of the way in which he revealed the treasures and the range of treasure types that he revealed. But I don't know of any other treasures that he revealed. I mean, he surely did, but they must be at the moment either kept secret or they haven't been included in Tenpa'i Wangchuk's collected works. This particular term is the only one on which Tenpa'i Wangchuk actually gave a commentary, which he did at the request of Deshek Lingpa. And Deshek Lingpa, when he passed away, there were a lot of miraculous signs, rainbows and earthquakes and things like that. So he was clearly a very extraordinary being, but that's about all we know about him. And I asked Yingme Rinpoche, who is to some extent overseeing this whole project. I asked for more details, but we haven't been able to find out any more about him.
Yeah, I was curious whether his Pemma Khandri Tuktik cycle, the heart essence of Padma Dakini, if there are other teachings as well besides what has been translated, what is being presented here, because the clarity and the language is so sort of clear and beautiful. I wondered if there are other teachings in this cycle besides this Semya Rangdul.
By Tenpa'i Wangchuk?
No, I mean...
of Deshek Lingpa?
Because there must have been a bigger cycle.
Yes. I don't know, quite frankly. I don't know.
So Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk and Deshek Lingpa were contemporaries. They knew each other. But interestingly, you shared earlier, they were both considered as incarnations of Yudra Nyingpo. So
yes.
In a way, there's a sort of a duplicate incarnation of Yudra Nyingpo, one coming as the Tertön, and then the other is supposed to be the Terdak, right? The custodian.
Yes.
Yes. I don't think there is any example in the past of one person coming in these two roles.
I haven't heard of one. I imagine it has happened, but yeah.
Yeah, and then Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk as well. I've come across him only very recently after his writings were published and became available. I've traveled to Eastern Tibet when he was alive, but I didn't hear of him. I definitely got a chance to see great teachers like Khyentse Jigme Phuntsho and Khenpo Achuk, but didn't even know about Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk. So tell us a bit more about him. I think a lot of the people in the audience would like to know as well.
Well, there again, he seems to have been hidden away in Golok for much of the time. he lived quite a bit longer than Deshek Lingpa. He was born in 1938 and only passed away in 2014. And he was quite an important Tulku. He was referred to as Natural Rinpoche. He was the Tulku of Padmakara Translation Group. And in this particular volume, we provided a sort of fairly brief biography of him. But in the first volume we published, the commentary on the Nelukja, Treasury of the Fundamental Nature, there's a rather longer one, which was extracted from the biography, which is in volume 1 of the collected works, which we haven't actually translated yet, and which I believe is being updated. But as an important Tulku, he was arrested by the Chinese during the Cultural Revolution and imprisoned. It was in prison that he met the lama who was actually his root teacher, Tertön Padma Jigme Dorje, who gave him all the teachings. How they managed to do this in these concentration camps, I simply don't know. And Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche, when he gave the transmission for this book the other day, was saying that he managed to accumulate unbelievable numbers of mantras and all these practices that they did. And it's beyond our understanding, really. When he came out of, released from prison, after that he started teaching a lot and also helping rebuild monasteries and all that. But the biography, as I said, the basic biography you can see at the beginning of the book. He studied quite a lot with the Golok tradition. So some of his, I guess, some of the Nyingma, there's a certain Golok interpretation, just as there is with, I think, some other lamas who studied in the, for example, Minyak Sonam. He was very influenced by that. But Tenpa'i Wangchuk was Tenpa'i Nyingma. Sorry, no, Tenpa'i Wangchuk. Yeah, Tenpa'i Wangchuk was a Tertön in his own right. And actually the first volume contains a few short Dzogchen texts that appear to be Termins as well. The collected works that were published don't include, I don't think, the sadhanas and all that he discovered. But he was a Tertön.
And the root text, the Tantra of what you translate as natural openness and freedom of the mind, semi-drumdal, that is supposed to be an Indian text which Deshek Lingpa discovers as mind treasure. But then when you read through the text, the language is actually very sort of contemporary. So I suppose a lot of people in the audience would also want to know what mind treasures mean and how this can be interpreted.
Well, first of all, I've never actually thought of it as an Indian text, partly because these Dzogchen texts that have come down through Guru Rinpoche, Manjushri Mitra, and Sri Sangha, because Sri Sangha was, according to what I've read, was in China most of the time. And Guru Rinpoche was up in Danakosha, I think. I don't think of them particularly as being Indian, as it were. perhaps the language that they used was Sanskrit, but who knows? Because particularly for these sort of teachings, some of it is all symbolic, and there isn't a particular language involved. But these particular teaching, it seems to have come down from Garab Dorje through, I suppose, Manjushri Mitra to Guru Rinpoche, and he gave it to, among others, Yudra Nyingpo and Yeshe Tsogyal, and then hid it as a Talma. Now, the Talmas, the treasure texts, are, to make it simple, divided into sort of the earth treasures and the mind treasures. The earth ones are written on scrolls, which are then hidden in rocks or wherever, and discovered later by usually one of Guru Padmasambhava's disciples, an emanation, in this case Yudra Nyingpo. And very often they'll be discovered with statues and other sort of treasures that are hidden with them. And for the mind treasures, well, that's even more mysterious in a way, but it seems to me it's as if those disciples received those teachings and then remembered them at an appropriate time later. And very often with the Talmud, there would be a prophecy of when and how it would be discovered. So in this case, it was as if Yudra Nyingpo was remembering this particular teaching, but having been sealed in his mind by Yeshe Tsogyal, presumably there had to be the appropriate tendrils, the circumstances for him to reveal it, in other words, for him to sort of remember it in a way. But of course, the minds of these beings are completely beyond our understanding. As I say, I don't think of it particularly as an Indian teaching, because Guru Rinpoche would have taught it and then hidden it for our age, to be revealed now. This is the thing with the Talmuds. It's the way of keeping the teachings fresh, and that they're destined for particular beings in a particular age. And they say that the Vajrayana teachings in general, and Dzogchen in particular, are all the more powerful as we go further and further into the, or down and down into the age of dregs, really. I must say, with the world, the situation the world is in at the moment, one feels one really needs very powerful teachings. So does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, I think my sort of reason why I thought it could be seen as an Indian text was because it started with the Sanskrit title, and I think, as you shared, yes, it's not always the case that the text would be Indian, although there may be a Sanskrit title at the beginning of it. And then there is the lineage as well, coming all the way down to Yeshe Tsogyal.
Yes.
Its origin to a non-Tibetan Indic origin. But what I thought... Sorry, please.
Sometimes the Sanskrit titles are sort of reverse engineered, if you like.
Yes.
You know, Tibetan writers have often given a title to a text, which is, you know, completely contemporary, and then given it a Sanskrit title as a sort of authentication, or for the auspiciousness of it.
Yeah. I think there is that category as well of a kind of a scholarly practice to give a Sanskrit title, even when it's an original Tibetan book. But this one at least claims some origin in Indian form.
Yes.
It goes before Tibet. But then I actually liked how you put it. I was thinking that sometimes we need to think about mind treasures and not necessarily see the text as coming all the way from say, non-Tibetan source, but rather the teachings. So the sort of essential message comes from those periods, get planted into somebody's psyche, and then it can be revealed in a more contemporary language. And this was what I thought this text would sort of be, because the language itself is quite a very easy, articulate Tibetan that we can understand today, even more easier and sort of contemporary than Longchenpa's syntax, right? So anyway, but now let's, we have some time. I think we should open to the audience as well. But before we do that, I want to ask you also about your, the experience and the insights you have as a translator. I mean, to begin with, you translated Semnyit Rangdul as natural openness and freedom of the mind. I mean, two different sort of phrases or concepts there, natural openness and freedom of the mind. But then you don't again get the nyit, the sem nyit. You get the sem, but not the nyit. So can you explain a bit about why you chose this translation?
Well, I have to admit, I followed Woolston and Helena on this, but they translated the Semnying Elso of Longchenpa, and they translated that as, I think, the finding rest in the nature of the mind, which is the nyit there, the nature, because I see in the Sixta Chenmo that Semni can either be just Sem Konai, just mind, or Semki Chunyi, and however you translate Chunyi, whether it's just the nature of the mind or the ultimate nature of the mind, one has to make a choice as a translator. And in this particular case, I think we could have said, well, openness and freedom is what we decided on for Rangdrul, because it's not simply freedom. And that's, I think, a decision that Woolston and Helena made quite a long time ago to really express this idea of drill. But it could have been translated as natural openness and freedom of the nature of the mind. But we've got nature twice there. And I think we just decided to drop that second nature. Of course, mind in a capital, the capital M, really.
Yeah, no, I see it. I can read it differently now.
Right.
The adjective natural can apply to both openness and freedom, perhaps. So it works for Rangdul and also Semnyit. the nyit nature and Rang nature can both go in with one. No, the word natural here, perhaps.
Deciding how to translate particular terms is just so difficult. There's so many different possibilities. What's going to be interesting is that Helena and Woolston have just sent in to the publishers Tenpa'i Wangchuk's commentary on the Cheyingzi, the treasury of the Dharma Dhatu, which will be very interesting to compare, well, not only from the translation point of view, but with the translation that Lama Chernam and Sangye Khandro have just produced, because Tenpa'i Wangchuk's commentary is his own commentary, and it's a word commentary. He does comment each word, whereas Longchenpa's auto-commentary, I've often found with the few that I've read of his auto-commentaries, that he'll explain some sections, but others he'll find it sufficient to just provide a quotation from a tantra or something. And one's left, as a translator, this is very frustrating, one's left with no real clue, extra information on how to translate the root verses. This is what was actually rather unique about Tenpa'i Wangchuk, was that he was the first Lama to actually write commentaries on Longchenpa. In all the 600 years that had passed, nobody had really dared to do that. there is another Lama who has translated who has written a commentary on the Mengyangsa, the Treasure of Pith Instructions, called Jamnyen Drupe Lodro. But these are the only commentaries that are not Longchenpa's auto commentaries. So that's going to be coming out. The commentary on the Chögyam is going to be coming out sometime next year. And there are other, I don't know if you wanted me to just give an overview of the different works that Tenpa'i Wangchuk wrote.
Yes, briefly, I think that'd be very useful.
Maybe I'll just have a quick look at that. Well, the fifth, there are 5 volumes, as I say. The fifth, going backwards, which is more or less how we're translating them, is the commentary on the precious treasury of the Dharma Dhatu. And then in the 4th volume, there's the precious treasury of the fundamental nature, which has already been published, and this present volume, the Treasure Tantra. And then that volume 4 ends with some pith instructions apparently discovered as a treasure by Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche Lama. I'm not quite sure about that, but that's what it seems. Then in the 3rd volume, there's a commentary on a Trekchö instruction called The Cloudless Sky, Nampa Trindral, by Tenpa'i Wangchuk's root teacher, Togden Lodro Gyatso, which seems to have been a mind treasure, although it wasn't sort of classified as a mind treasure. And that is in the process of being translated. And then there's a couple of Zintri. There's one on Garab Dorje's Siksum Nidik, the 3 statements that strike the key points, and a commentary on the Rinzin Dupa, the Longchen Nitik, the Inner Sadhana, the Assembly of Vidyadharas. That's already been translated by Guillaume Avertin. So it's not, a priority for us to do that as well. There's also a Zintri, some notes on the Jampel Dzogpa Chempo Mönlam, the prayer of aspiration of Manjushri. And then the 2nd volume has much more sutra-orientated works. There's a commentary on Mrutya Togme's Gyaltse Laklen, the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva. There's a sort of a text of instructions on the 4 mind changes, the 4 reflections that turn the mind toward the Dharma. That's been translated into French, actually. We've published it here. There's a commentary on Jigme Lingpa's prayer to be reborn in the copper-collared mountain. That's already been translated again by Lotsawa House, so we won't necessarily do that immediately. There's a commentary on Karma Chakme's Dewa Chempo Mönlam, Decheng Mönlam, the prayer to be reborn in Sukhavati, and another commentary on the Dzogchen Mönlam, the prayer of good action. And then finally, there's 2 auto commentaries by Tenpa'i Wangchuk on a couple of poems which are included in the 1st volume. One of them is a praise of solitary retreat. And the 1st volume is lots of little texts. Some of them are only a couple of pages long. There's 30 poems. There's 26 spiritual songs and counsels, mainly related to the Great Perfection. And those include, as I say, 4 termas of Tenpa'i Wangchuk himself. And then there's a whole lot of short practice texts. Many of them are sort of advice to disciples who requested them, and short prayers. So that's basically what eventually, in the next few years, we hope to be publishing.
Wonderful. Now, with this book that you brought out, Natural Openness and Freedom of the Mind, I think you already have a little bit in the book about who this is for and how people should access it or approach it. If you can share a little bit here, and then we'll open to the audience.
Well, there's an enormous amount of interest at the moment in the Dzogchen teachings. And so this book is very much intended for people who really intend to practice the teachings under the guidance of a teacher. I think this is really important, that people realize that Dzogchen is not the experience of Dzogchen, Rigpa awareness is something that's beyond the intellect. So although it's helpful and perhaps necessary to have some intellectual understanding of Dzogchen, it really does depend on the relationship with the teacher. There's that famous story about Lungtok Tenpa Nyuma, who was the disciple of Patrul Rinpoche, and in fact he spent 28 years with Patrul Rinpoche. And at one point, Patrul Rinpoche, they were up on the mountainside above Dzogchen Monastery, and Patrul Rinpoche said to him, have you understood the nature of the mind yet? And Lungtok Tenpa Nyuma said, well, I don't think so. And so my video is playing up again. And so he, Patrul Rinpoche said, come here and lie down. It was after dark. And he said, can you see the stars in the sky above? And Lungtok said, yes. Can you hear the dogs barking down at Dzogchen Monastery in the valley below? Yes. Can you hear us talking together? Yes. Patrul said, that's it. And Lungtok Tenpa Nyuma said later that at that moment he had this incredible realization of awareness, naked awareness. And there's not a single word of Dzogchen there. There's no mention of Rigpa. There's not even all these Dzogchen terms like Salewa, Rigewa, and all that. This was just a normal conversation, but it was the transfer of the teacher's realization to the mind of the disciple. And I think to really get it in Dzogchen, one does have to have that incredible trust and devotion to the teacher. Of course, it's a bit difficult to spend 28 years with one's teacher these days, or Manjusha Mitra spent 70 years with Guru Dorje. But I think probably necessary to be around the teacher for as much as one can, if one's really going to be able to absorb that realization. The other thing is one has to be ready for it. Of course, one has to have a lot of merit from one's past lives. One has to have purified obscurations. And the way one does that is through the ngundro, the preliminary practices. Because Yudra Nyingpo in his Richa, the Mountain Dharma, says that although they're called preliminary practices, that actually in our tradition, referring to the Dzogchen, it's the main practice. And in fact, if one really has practiced the ngundro, and it's not just a qualification, one sees sometimes that for people to attend particular teachings or to read a particular book, that they must have completed the ngundro. But it's not like in the old days, in order to get into a university, one had to, certain universities, one had to have passed an examination in Latin, even though one was never going to read or look at Latin again in one's life. But here it's not just a qualification like that, it's really something that one has to have really completed, not necessarily once, but several times, from what I've understood. And in fact, even though there are people who think that they can skip the ngundro, they try and practice Dzogchen, but according to our teachers, it doesn't really work. But at the same time, many of the ngundro texts in the Dzogchen cycles, for example, in the Longchen Nyingtik, they contain elements of the ideas, they introduce the ideas of Dzogchen actually in the ngundro, particularly in the Guru Yoga. And even in the Longchen Nyingtik, even the refuge prayer that one says, I think it's the third line, Law Function Tushi Kyoko La, in the mandala of the nature, the character, the cognitive potency or compassion, or whatever one calls it. In that mandala, there's three essential Dzogchen facets, one's taking refuge. So I just want to say that, you know, this book is designed for people who really want to practice Dzogchen, but also they really have to practice the Ngundro, and particularly the Guru Yoga. That is how this relationship with the teacher can really develop. And of course, it's confidence in the teacher, but of course the teachers have confidence in us as well.
Thank you, Stephen. So let's come to questions from the audience.
Yes, there are a few questions coming in. Please, everyone, send more questions with Q&A function or on Facebook. You can use the comments there. So there's one general question on Facebook asking about the difference between understanding and experiencing natural openness to freedom of the mind. So I guess they're asking a bit about, yeah, again, you've talked a little bit about this already, but maybe say a little bit more about what this natural openness and freedom of the mind is, and the difference between understanding it and experiencing it.
Well, I think understanding it is with the intellect. Experiencing it is something that will happen with the introduction from the teacher. And that introduction, classically, it occurs, you know, when one does a 3-year retreat, for example. One's done the Ngundro, but one's also done the different sadhanas, the Kyerim and the Dzogchen, and these are all, of course, means by which one accumulates merit and purifies obscuration. And then sort of classically or officially, if you like, there's the Rikpe Tselwong, which is the empowerment by which awareness is introduced. And at that moment, one is, if one's ready, one will have a true realization of awareness. It'll be something that you know, is part of one's being, as it were. And the actual practice of Trekchö is maintaining that experience. But if you read through the book, you'll see that it's completely beyond intellect. So although it's important to have an intellectual understanding, and particularly to have an understanding of the traps and obstacles that can get in the way of the meditation. Basically, it seems such a simple meditation, but our conceptual minds are so used to sort of conceptualizing that to get rid of all that one needs to understand how to recognize those things intellectually. But yeah, I think that's all I can really say. The difference between understanding and realization is one is intellectual, the other is completely beyond.
Right, that makes sense. So there's an interesting follow-up on that, which is asking about the title freedom of the mind. Is this not freedom from the mind? What is the mind becoming free of? And so what do you mean by mind here?
Because we're talking, well, as we talked about earlier, it's the nature of the mind. We're talking about the enlightened mind, really, here. And so this is what we're opening up. We're not talking about the intellectual dualistic mind. And so that mind, which is enlightened mind, and in the book you'll see that it's described in different ways, but it is described as the Dharmakaya, as bodhicitta, as Buddha nature. That is completely beyond the the ordinary mind. And so that is a mind that is naturally open and free. So that's where we are talking about openness and freedom of the mind here.
Great. Yeah. Wonderful. So there's another question that's maybe a little more detailed, asking about how the text appears to discuss alaya vijnana, and yet you didn't use that term. They're asking about alaya vijnana, and also in that question is a question about how this might be related to Jonang philosophy, which may or may not make sense with that other question. But maybe first the alaya vijnana question.
Quite frankly, I don't know how to how to answer that. It does. I can't remember where in the text it mentions that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, actually.
The trouble is, as a translator, one tends to, after one's completed a translation, it goes off to the publishers and one's on to the next translation, and one tends to forget some of the details of what's once translated.
That's understandable.
If I may respond to this question, if the question is about alaya vijnana and the nature of mind that Dzogchen deals with, I think in the Nyingma tradition particularly, alaya vijnana is still a vijnana. It's a concept, it's a dualistic mind. It's a dualistic consciousness. So it's not really the nature of the mind. It's one of the 8 consciousnesses. But then we have to remember that the term alaya, or the Tibetan term Khyentse, is repeatedly used in the Dzogchen context, not referring to the Khyentse Namshe as such, not to the alaya vijnana, but to the ground, the ground reality, which is the nature of the mind. So yes, you find Khyentse almost sometimes put as a synonym for the nature of the mind. But then alaya vijnana would certainly, as we find in the Abhidharma text, be one of the 8 consciousnesses, and therefore a dualistic consciousness of the ordinary samsara.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Yeah. There's also a question generally about Deshek Lingpa or Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk's disciples, and whether they're teaching in Asia or in the West, or if there's a continued lineage there.
Well, Tulku Lhatsam, as far as I know, he came just once to France to give us the transmissions, and since then I think he's just been in Tibet. I haven't heard of him traveling in Asia or outside Tibet, but maybe he has. I really don't know. Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche is based, I think, quite a lot of the time in California, and I don't know to what extent he teaches. Nico Odysseus of Shambhala originally asked him to give the transmission of the root text of this book, but he thought that he asked us to relay the request to Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche. So I don't know to what extent he teaches, but it's his foundation, which is to a large extent funding parts of these translations.
Okay. Nico just made a comment saying that Khentrul Lodro Taye is Deshek Lingpa's nephew.
Right. Yes, I'd forgotten that he'd said that. Yeah.
Great. Great. Well, Karma, are there any other questions you want to address or things you would like to bring up?
Are you done with the questions? I thought there were a few more questions on Zoom, but maybe.
There are a few more coming in.
I think the questions like, how do you determine whether or not a teacher is qualified to teach Dzogchen?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you actually wanted to address that. Would you like to say something about that?
That's a difficult question.
Yeah.
because, for example, in Treasure Rinpoche's commentary on Linguntra, the preliminary practices, he actually quotes from Longchenpa, as far as I remember, it's from the Yishinzu, the qualifications, if you like, of a teacher. And they give a whole lot of very detailed qualifications in different verses. But at the end, he says that nowadays, and not all teachers, one can't expect to find all these qualities in a teacher, and that at the very minimum, they should have the bodhicitta and compassion. So apart from that, I don't really know how one can recognize a qualified Dzogchen teacher apart from by repute. I mean, we were fortunate enough to receive teachings from great masters like Yudra Nyingpo and Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche. So the question simply didn't arise; they were so evidently realized. But nowadays, it can't be easy. I think one just has to, as I say, what other people find and say, particularly if there are other lamas who can guide us to finding the right teacher. And also it's a question of one's own feeling, whether one trusts this teacher. And that's what it boils down to, actually, is the devotion.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if there is anywhere a specific description of a Dzogchen teacher, because we have lots of literature on the good teacher, or the Gywe Shingen, Kalyani Mitra, both for general Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, and then also for Vajrayana, the qualities of a Lama, which we can find in many books. And I think the work by Jigme Lingpa, the Treasure of Good Qualities, which Padmakara has translated, it has actually fantastic chapters on a good teacher. I suppose for a Dzogchen master, the fundamental would be you have to have that Dzogchen transmission and realize it yourself before becoming a teacher. And that would be difficult to tell, at least the second part. But then again, I suppose, depending on your own sort of disposition, if you go with the anecdote that you shared from Padmakara Rinpoche and Yeshe Lungtok, like a Zen koan, you could get the glimpse of the nature of your mind being with any teacher if you are in the right, I suppose, mood, right sort of state of.
I think it can even happen without the teacher being there. So simply the thought of the teacher. Well, I was reading something, I think it was Jigme Khyentse, who suddenly thought of his teacher, and at that moment, he had an experience of realization. Yeah.
So if there are no other questions, I have a silly little question, Stephen, I hope you wouldn't mind. When you transcribe, when you write Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk, you include Tenpa'i with an apostrophe. I was just curious, what makes Padmakara Translation Group use that apostrophe? Is there a reason behind it?
I think it's how we've always done it, actually. And I think it follows Shambhala's sort of rules of phoneticization as well. Otherwise, I would have expected.
Sorry, please.
I would have expected them to change it
Okay. So it's not your tradition, but Shambhala's.
Actually, our editors are extremely indulgent with us, and you know, they let us get away with all sorts of things that they won't let other authors do.
I was curious, so I went even looking for how you wrote Khyentse Wangpo. And then with Khyentse Wangpo, you just decided to say Khyentse Wangpo, not Khyentse Wangpo.
That's true. That's true. Yes. Yeah.
So,
no, it's not very consistent.
anyway, it's just a query or curiosity I had. But anyway, thank you very much for sharing this work. And the book is now out and available for people to get it, right? And as Stephen shared, I think if you're interested in Dzogchen, you should get book, but then, of course, access it following the traditional procedures, the appropriate, the right procedures. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you're all well and see you again in a month's time or so. Thank you, Stephen, for...
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to also say thank you and just put up here the images of the books. This is so far the 2 books that have come out in the series of Khangsar Tenpa'i Wangchuk's collected works. So there's more to come. And I put the links in the chat and also on Facebook so you can find out more about the Padmakara Translation Group and about this book on Shambhala Publications website. So thank you again to both of you. And thank you, Stephen, also for all of your work over these many years. It's really amazing to see how many books you've worked on. And yeah, we rejoice in your amazing blessings that you have to be able to work on this material for so long. So thank you.
Well, I hope I'll be able to continue. And Karma, since we started with the bodhicitta, I don't know if I managed to really keep the Yeshe Nikpa Mepa, but it'd be nice if we could at least the Ngoa, the Jing Ngoa, would be nice if you have the prayer. That would be good. Dedicate.
Can we all dedicate the merit that we've accumulated in this session and all the other times for all sentient beings to reach the ultimate state of Buddhahood? So nam di thamche zikwa thopne ne be danam phamje kega na che balak tubai sibe sole do nam do wara so. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Have a great weekend.
And you.